John Milton's Paradise Lost is, without argue, one of the greatest triumphs of the Christian imagination. We have all heard the term, the event, the war in heaven, but much of our knowledge of the war in heaven actually comes from Milton's epic poem. Taking the story of the war in heaven and giving it detail, especially in Book 6, Milton also makes constant use of classical and biblical imagery and references to bolster his lively imaginative retelling. As Raphael tells the story of the war in heaven to Adam, the images of chariots run replete throughout the story and is one of the recurring images of the discourse. And in the process of giving us the story of the war in heaven, Milton does something remarkable with that image of the chariot. Chariots are one of the great images of war in the human psyche. A terrifying weapon, the chariot was the first great engine of war. As such, chariots are depicted all throughout classical literature, and it must never be forgotten that Milton was a student of classical literature. After Achilles has slayed Hector, he defiles Hector's body over the beaches of Troy in his chariot. Chariots are symbols of earthly power in Exodus, as the Israelites are pursued by Pharaoh's charioteers before being swallowed up by the Red Sea. In Greek mythology, as told by Ovid, Phaeton disobeys his father and takes control of the sun chariot to try and ascend into heaven, to prove his divinity, only to be struck down to save the earth from being destroyed by Phaeton's pride. Pride cometh before the fall. The name Phaeton means luminous or shining in Greek. This is important because, unlike today, traditional Christianity, even in its Protestant form, as reflected by Milton or even more recently by C.S. Lewis, believed that the pagan gods and pagan myths were garbled versions of the Christian story and pointed to the truth of the Christian theological drama. Satan, whose name before the fall was Lucifer, also means shining one, morning star, and has a direct connection to Phaeton in several ways, which Milton is aware of and alludes to throughout his depiction of the war in heaven. Both of their names mean luminous, but both bear a false luminosity. Both were prideful in what they attempted to do. Both, in what they attempted to do, were guilty of appropriating to themselves what only true divinity could do. And as such, both fell as a result of their prideful and wrongful attempted appropriation of what was not theirs. In Milton's imagination, there is therefore a connection between the fall of Satan and the fall of Phaeton. That is, the story of Phaeton is the garbled and inaccurate story of the fall of Satan. As Raphael begins to tell the story of the war in heaven to Adam, as part of his mission from God to inform Adam of his adversary who will tempt Eve to bring about the fall of man, he describes Satan in the imagery of a prideful and disobedient apostate in a chariot. That image, to the literate people of 17th century England, would have immediately conjured up and alluded to Phaeton. Raphael says, "High in the midst, exalted as a god, the apostate in his sun-bright chariot sat idol of majesty divine, enclosed with flaming cherubim and golden shields." The first depiction of Satan in the war in heaven is a direct allusion, as mentioned, to Phaeton and his seizure of his father's chariot as an idol of majesty divine. The image that Milton uses here, to the educated reader, prefigures the fall of Satan on two accounts. First, from the obvious fact of Christian theology that Satan and the rebellious angels who followed him were in fact expelled from heaven. Second, from the obvious allusion to Ovid's story of Phaeton, who in the same bid, like Satan, took up idol of majesty divine, and was struck down by Zeus, the supreme god, and fell to the earth, burned to a crisp. As the war in heaven is continued to be told, and as on the second day of battle Satan's rebellious angels cause Michael and the heavenly angels to retreat, God the Father instructs God the Son to take to the fight, and in doing so receive all the glory, honor, and praise for defeating the perfidious and rebellious angels. The Son, of course, accepts the Father's command. Milton deliberately interjects at this moment charioteer imagery in drawing from the prophet Ezekiel and the Psalms. The chariot of paternal deity, flashing thick flames, wheel within wheel undrawn, itself instinct with spirit, but convoyed by 4 cherubic shapes, he onward came, far off his coming shone, and 20,000 I their number heard, chariots of God, half on each hand were seen. He on the wings of the cherub rode sublime, on the crystalline sky, in sapphire throned. While drawing from Ezekiel of the chariot of paternal deity, flashing thick flames, wheel within wheel undrawn, and the Psalms, Psalm 68 and 18 specifically, in describing the 20,000 chariots of God and the Son, who on the wings of the cherub rode sublime, Milton contrasts 2 images of the chariot and charioteer in describing the war in heaven. Like with Phaeton in Ovid's mythology, the image of Satan's chariot is of divinity appropriated, an idol, a false deity, and one covered sun bright. Again, you should see the direct allusions to Phaeton. The true chariot, however, radiates because it is driven on by the true light of the world, the sun, where Satan's chariot, as with Phaeton's appropriation of his father's role in Ovid, smacks of apostasy and false majesty, Christ's chariot exudes true divinity in being carried by the wings of the cherub and in sapphire throne, indicating his divine royalty. Christ, the Son of God, enters the battle to fight and defeat Satan and the rebellious legions. So spoke the Son, and into terror changed his countenance, too severe to behold, and full of wrath, bent on his enemies. The steadfast Empyrean shook throughout, all but the throne itself of God. As Christ's wrath is unleashed unto the rebellious angels, Milton also alludes to Hesiod's Theogony, where Zeus left his palace to battle Typhoeus, and to Isaiah 13:12, again intersplicing and linking the pagan stories with biblical revelation. The intervention of the Son against Satan turns the tide of war, and he drives the rebel angels to their doom. Headlong themselves they threw down from the verge of heaven, eternal wrath, burnt after them to the bottomless pit. Hell heard the unsufferable noise. Hell saw heaven ruining from heaven, and would have fled affrighted. In the contest of the 2 chariots in the war in heaven, Milton shows us which charioteer is worthy of riding the chariot of destiny. Moreover, we see in the images of the 2 charioteers one who attempts to ascend in prideful disobedience, and another who rides forth in undertaking the will of God. The conclusion of this clash of chariots follows. 9 days they fell, confounded chaos roared, and felt tenfold confusion in their fall. Through his wide anarchy, so huge a rout encumbered him with ruin. Hell at last, yawning, received them whole, and on them closed. Hell, their fit habitation, fraught with fire, unquenchable, the house of woe and pain. Sole victor from the expulsion of his foes, Messiah his triumphal chariot turned, to meet him all his saints, who silent stood, eye-witness of his mighty acts, with jubilee advanced. Where Phaeton was unable to return his father's chariot because he was struck down, so too is Satan struck down from his chariot by the intervention of God. Christ, however, unlike Phaeton, Satan, returns the chariot to his father. And where Phaeton, Satan, had hoped to win the praises of mortals to ascend to his divinity by deed, failed, Christ, in success, turned to return the chariot to the thunderous jubilation of the angelic host, who recognized their Messiah, their King. Milton's imagination reigned supreme in his depiction of the war in heaven. Indeed, earlier in his epic poem, Milton spoke of the importance of the imagination and its relationship to the Godhead, to divinity. The weaving together of the Greek myths with the Christian revelation is also an incredible work of Milton's imaginative prowess. While not unique, as this was common practice in Christian literature and apologia, the uniqueness and ingenuity of Milton emerges in the manner of his interweaving the classical and biblical traditions together. Since these stories are told to Adam, the father of humanity, by the angel Raphael prior to his fall, prior to his corruption of knowledge that stemmed from the fall, Milton ties the eventual pagan stories to being what Raphael had communicated to Adam before they became corrupted post-fall, taking on lives of their own. Thus, Milton is even sanctifying the pagan stories in Paradise Lost by directly associating all of them with the story of the war in heaven. The pagan stories are corrupted stories of what Raphael told Adam. Adam's knowledge also is not yet fully formed, but he displays his inquisitiveness as part of what it means to be human. In Christian anthropology, part of being made in the image of God means to be inquisitive, to desire knowledge, to be rational. You are made in love for love, but also in wisdom for wisdom. Raphael recounts not only the story of the war in heaven to Adam, but also the story of creation, Book 7. In doing so, and in intermixing the images of Greek mythology in Raphael's discourses to Adam, all of this prior to the fall of man and the confusion of language after the destruction of the Tower of Babel, Milton gives a nod to the oral tradition. That is, Adam was telling these stories to his children, and they to theirs, as the generations of man multiplied. But having fallen from paradise, and with the confusion of knowledge and language a consequence of the fall, the stories told by Raphael to Adam, and then from Adam to his descendants, and his descendants to their descendants, became corrupted, leading to the garbling of the Christian revelation in the pagan mythological traditions, all of which show signs of the Christian story, which is Milton's point, by interweaving and redeeming the pagan myths in his own story. As it relates to Milton's triumph of the use of the image of the chariot and the charioteer in the war in heaven, there can be no doubting that he ties Phaeton and Satan, Lucifer, together. In prideful disobedience, Satan attempts to become a god in his war on heaven, but is struck down by the true charioteer, the Son of God. In this interweaving of the Greek and biblical accounts, and in the grander imaginative scope of Milton's work, Milton also alludes to the ancient Christian tradition begun by St. Paul in his first book of his Epistle to the Romans, that all the pagan stories retain a faint glimpse of the Christian truth, despite having been corrupted over time. In this respect, Milton redeems the pagan stories of tragedy and fall and of the power of chariots within Paradise Lost. Milton points to the redemption of the image of the chariot and the charioteer with the one whom Jubilee sounds eternal. It is not an image and a weapon of war. It is an image and weapon of salvation. Amid chaos and despair, Milton points the reader to how one reaches heaven, the glory and eternal reality of the Father God, pious submission to his will, rather than the prideful arrogance of self-ascendancy. And in telling this story in The War in Heaven, Milton also gave to posterity the imagery and the story that we don't actually really find in the Bible, but we all believe to have happened. For it is Paradise Lost that the grand war in heaven unfolds before our very eyes. That story, that ancient story of pride leading to the fall in a grand battle against God.